You don't have a great idea of what the weather is going to be for the games that weekend.
I'm just a weatherman. I wasn't ready to play God today.
Here are 55 tips to help you win your fantasy league. None of them require any knowledge of football. I'm Byron Cobalt from byron-cobalt.com and a featured writer for Fantasy Pros. I'm releasing this video during the 2023 season, but these tips apply no matter when it is. So if I reference players that are only playing right now, don't worry about it. This video is meant to be useful for both fantasy football veterans and rookies. So if you're new to fantasy, I'll add a little bit of detail around each tip to make sure you have the proper context. If any tip requires you to be morally flexible, I will indicate that with the morally flexible symbol. So keep an eye out for that if you want to play it super clean. But I'm not judging. I'm going to put the tip out there. It's going to be up for you and whether or not you want to use it. I'm just the messenger here. In the interest of making it quick, I'm not letting myself use the bathroom until I'm done. So let's go. First section is for waivers and ad drops. Tip number 1, the bye week edition. Fantasy football every week, players will be added on waivers once they play to be let off of waivers on Wednesday morning. And the reason for this is so that you're not racing with everyone else in your league to pick up a player. In a league once, Anquan Bolden went off as a rookie and people were just like sprinting to their cars to go home and pick up the player because this is before phones. Waivers will prevent that. However, many leagues will allow you to pick up a player who's on bye during the game, so he'll still be a free agent, say on Monday. Take advantage of the bye week edition if your league allows it. Otherwise, they'll go on waivers with everyone else at the end of the Monday night game. Tip number 2, team defense streaming look ahead. Most leagues require you to play a team defense in your starting lineup, and often the best strategy for playing a team defense is to look at matchups each week and to play the defense who's playing the weakest offense. If you get to a point where you don't have a lot of great options for defense, don't just look at who the defense is playing this week. Look a week ahead. You may be able to find a team that has a great matchup coming, and you maybe don't get a great matchup this week, but you'll get them next week. Tip number 3, the $0 waiver edition. Many leagues will have a free agent auction budget where you can bid on players that are on waiver. This is a way to ensure that when everyone has a chance to pick up a player when they're on waivers, that only the team that really wants it the most and is willing to pony up the most of their budget will get them. For the players that are not worth any budget, that often means that you're going to wait until waivers pass and then you'll place a pickup request the next day when there are no time restrictions, players off of waivers. Well, you may want to consider instead, put a bid on the player for $0. You won't use up any of your waiver budget, but you'll get them before the free agency period begins. And you get them before everyone else. Tip number 4, the multi-ad uni-drop waiver priority. During the waiver period, if you want to put in multiple waiver claims, most fantasy football platforms will require you to prioritize them. If you have a player on your team that you want to drop and multiple players that you want to add, you don't have to choose a different player to drop for each of the potential additions. Let's say you had 3 players you wanted to pick up. Players A, B, and C, but you really only have 1 player you want to drop. You don't have to set up your waiver priorities as if they're all going to happen. You can set them all to drop the same player. You will simply process the highest priority move that you can get. You don't have to worry about those other claims because they won't happen. Tip number 5, the IR train. Many leagues will allow you to have an injured reserve spot on your roster. This is where players who are either on the injured reserve for their NFL team or are out for a week can go into your injured reserve spot. It's effectively an extra roster spot. When you're picking a player up, if your reserve spot or spots are empty, don't just pick up a player that you want. First, pick up a player who's already on injured reserve that's a free agent. You can take that player, put him in the injured reserve spot, and you still have an open spot in your roster to pick someone else up. You never know, when that player you picked up comes off of injured reserve, it might be exactly who you need to add to your roster. If you have multiple IR slots, even better. I play in one league with 4 injured reserve slots. It's a pretty big league. And when I have the chance, I'll add sometimes 2 and 3 injured players when I get a chance. That's why it's called the IR train, because you can then go add, and slot them in to your IR spots before you pick up the player you actually want. Tip number 6, use position scarcity. The one situation where this is likely to come up is if you're in a super flex league, which usually means a league where you can start 2 quarterbacks, and it's a large league. The tip is, if there are starting quarterbacks on the free agent wire, just pick them up within reason. You don't want to fill up your entire bench to be quarterbacks, but if you have 3 quarterbacks on your team and there's only 1 free agent starter, pick them up. Quarterbacks are very valuable in superflex leagues because they score a lot of points. And if there's any situation where your opponent can't start 2 of them, that's a huge advantage for you. So you want to slightly increase that chance by picking up the available quarterbacks. Pick number 7, the Saturday drop and pickup. If you're about to pick up a player and there's a low likeliness that someone else is going to beat you to him, wait till Saturday to pick him up. The reason for this, The player you drop will then likely be on waivers through the Sunday games, and no one else will be able to pick them up and use them against you. So time it up if you can afford to wait. Make your low priority ad drops on Saturdays. Next section of tips is lineup management. Tip number 8, the 11:30 rush. The best time to pick up free agents, especially if you're in a pinch for starting a player that's any good, is 11:30 a.m. Eastern on Sundays. The reason for this is when NFL teams will declare who's active for the 1 o'clock games. A lot of players will be declared inactive, sometimes surprise players. Players you didn't expect before 11:30 we're going to play may look like they're going to get some action. What you do at 11:30 then is check in and look to see which free agents are being added the most frequently. You may be able to pick up on a trend and take advantage. Tip number 9, the Sunday morning weather report.
The rain keeps coming down and down. When will it stop?
It's 2023 when I'm making this video. Everyone has access to oodles of expert rankings for how to set their lineup every week. But when experts set their rankings, typically on Wednesdays, sometimes even earlier in the week, you don't have a great idea of what the weather is going to be for the games that weekend.
I'm just a weatherman. I wasn't ready to play God today.
Especially late in the season, when you have the risk of snow games or very bad weather games. Check the weather. You may want to switch out a player, say a quarterback who's going to play in the snow, or you want to play a defense that's going to play in the snow. Tip number 10, clear out the flex spot on Thursday nights. Never start a player in your flex on a Thursday night game if you can avoid it. In fact, you should always have your flex spot be the player playing as late as possible. The reason for this, because things happen in warm-ups of games, and you never know who's gonna get hurt and need a sub, and you want to make sure you maximize your options. If a player suddenly can't play and is in your flex, you can replace him with a running back or a wide receiver. If a player suddenly can't play and is in your running back slot or your wide receiver slot, you're limited to replacing them with a running back or a wide receiver, respectively. So keep your flex open, especially for Thursday nights, because a lot can happen between Thursday and the Sunday game. Tip number 11, opponent correlations. Different fantasy players will impact each other. Obvious examples, quarterbacks doing well mean the receivers on that NFL team will also probably do well. That means that they're correlated, positively correlated. Quarterbacks and running backs on the same team are often negatively correlated, and any offensive player and the defense playing against those players in real life are also going to be negatively correlated. If you have players on your team that are positively correlated, they're likely to score well together, and that's in general a good thing. If you have players on your team that are negatively correlated, your team scoring may be more consistent. You're limiting the high end of your scoring. You may be raising your floor up a little bit, but you want to be aware of this both for your lineup and for your opponent's lineup. If you're an underdog and need to beat, say, the best team in your league in a given week, maybe you'll avoid the situation where you're playing the wide receiver that is the target of their quarterback, or vice versa. Because if they do well, both sides are probably doing well, and that doesn't help you that much. However, if you're the favorite, maybe you do want to look for situations like that. Decrease the likeliness that they're able to catch up to you. Tip number 12, your own defense, negative correlations. This is similar to the previous tip. The tip is really just be aware of correlations. If you have a big lead, or if you're a heavy favorite in a week, you may want to play conservatively, and you can play a defense, say playing against your starting quarterback. But if you need to catch up, you don't want to do that because they're not both going to do well. And if you need both of them to do well to win, it's a bad strategy. Tip number 13, the injured player in the weekly ranking. When expert rankings come out every week for fantasy football, there's often injury uncertainty. A player who's not clear is going to play on Wednesday, but then plays on Sunday, will likely be underranked. So what you want to do to look for these inefficiencies is when you look at weekly rankings, look both at not just at the average rank for a player, look at how highly they are ranked by some experts. Compare that number, because some experts are probably assuming that player is going to play. That may be more of a true proxy for how the player would be ranked if they were healthy. That will allow you to make switches when the time comes and you find out if the player's playing or not. Tip number 14. Related tip, the Friday rankings update. The Friday practice for NFL teams is a big one. If a player plays on a Friday practice, they're likely to play in the game. And if a player doesn't participate in practice, they're a risk. Often on Fridays, experts will update their weekly rankings. So remember to check your weekly rankings on Fridays just to make sure you have the latest information. Tip number 15, the suboptimal early play. If you have an injured player who's questionable, that may or may not play, and you have another player who's almost as good that is playing, but plays before the injured player, you may want to play the healthy guy. It depends on how close the players are in their outlook for the week, but you don't want to be stuck with an injured player. That's really bad. If you can avoid having stuck with an injured player on Sunday night by playing a slightly worse player at 1 p.m. or maybe on a Thursday, you want to do that. It's a good idea. Not to mention something could always happen and you could forget to bench a player, which is really bad. All right, that's it for roster management. Let's move now to the next section. Snake drafting. Snake draft is how most drafts are set up, where you take turns drafting players. These tips won't be that useful during the season, but they'll be helpful for your 2024 drafts and beyond. Tip number 16. Watch the roster grid. A big aspect of snake drafts is filling in your starting roster slots. Most fantasy players will make a point to try and get at least one player, or really to fill up their starting positions before they go into their bench position. There's no rule saying you have to do this. It's just how most players actually draft. So if you want to know who your opponents are going to draft, keep an eye on that roster grid, especially if your draft slot's at the end of a round. Say you have only a couple picks between your pick and your following one. If you need a tight end, but every team that's picking in between this pick and your next one also already has a tight end, you're probably safe to wait on a tight end. So watch the roster. Tip 17, wait on defense and kickers. Defense and kickers are the highest variance positions and the most difficult positions to predict in fantasy football, and really aren't even that impactful if you really predict their performance well. You should wait until the last 2 rounds of your draft to draft one defense and then one kicker. There's really no reason to deviate from that unless your league scoring systems are very strange. Tip 18. Use alternative ranks for your snake draft. Many drafting apps or fantasy football apps will allow you to load your own rankings before a draft. This is very useful to do. The rankings don't have to be better ranks. They just have to be good enough ranks. The reason why is if you have your own set of rankings in a draft, you'll be able to toggle between something like your average draft position within that app and your list. And it's going to point out opportunities to draft players higher than everyone else, or spots where you may want to wait on players more than everyone else. The point is not necessarily that you're making better decisions, but you can be comfortable deviating from the crowd a little bit. You will find a few values, and honestly, finding a few values in a draft makes the whole thing worth it. If all you're going by are the rankings everyone else is going by, it's going to be a lot harder to spot a value in the middle of a draft, especially when you have a minute and a half or so to make each pick. Tip number 19, simply talk about the players you don't want. Now, it would be kind of obvious if you went into a draft and you tried to pump up all these players that you didn't want to pick. I mean, I made the opposite mistake my first ever time in a fantasy football draft. I was talking about Matt Hasselbeck and how great it was going to be, but I wanted Hasselbeck. And someone took it and I got upset. So don't do that. You don't want to be so on the nose as to try and pump up a player you don't want, because people will smell that a mile away. If you talk about Matt Hasselbeck and you don't want Matt Hasselbeck, you probably don't, because he's in his late 40s by now. If, say, you didn't like the top tight ends in the league in a given year, you're not playing the draft a tight end early, you could talk about tight ends in general. So like, oh, it was a pretty good tight end class, huh? Because the simple act of talking about tight ends is a psychology trick. Will make people more likely to pick them and see the value of them when it comes to their turn. So you may do the same thing of, say, pumping up a Mark Andrews, but just talking about just tight ends in general, without tipping your hand that you're trying to get other people to pick Mark Andrews. Next section, auction drafts. Auction drafts are where instead of taking turns picking players, everyone has an auction budget and you bid on players as whoever bids the most on a player gets them. You take that money out of your budget and you keep on bidding until everyone's team is complete. Or maybe you go for just 10 rounds and then you snake draft from there. Doesn't matter. These tips apply to any kind of auction draft you might be in. Tip number 20, use custom league draft values. Now, I could maybe make a long video of how to do this on your own, but it's worth it to do some research to see if you can find a program online, or maybe you're able to do it on your own and you're that savvy as it is. You can customize dollar value ratings for players to your league setting. For example, if you're in a 14-team league, players are going to be worth different amounts of money from your auction budget than if you're in a 12-team league. You simply have more money in the pot in a 14-team league, all else being equal. And depending on what roster positions you have or your scoring system, those numbers can change even more. Make custom values or find custom values if you can do it. Tip 21, use a bias tracker. Assuming you have auction values where the value of all players adds up to the same as everyone's budget put together, you can do this. As you're going through an auction draft and a player gets picked, keep track of 2 numbers. 1, what the player's recommended value was, and 2, what the player's actual bid value was. That way you can keep track of how much money is left in everyone's pockets versus how much value is left on the draft board. If there's more money left in everyone's pockets than there's value left in the draft board, you can expect players to be going for premiums. If you have less money in everyone's pocket than the value of players on the board, you're going to find a lot of bargains. And that's actually when you want to be making your picks. As long as you stay on top of just recording these 2 numbers with every player that goes up, you can do this pretty effectively. And you especially want to look and see when things are trending one direction or another. If whether the bias is you're building up a surplus of value or a deficit of value. I hope I got the hand signals right there through all of that. Tip number 22, the late bid. If you want a player, you don't have to tip your hand early by bidding on them right when they go on the board. You can wait. You can wait until the last second, and it's kind of fun if you do. Tip 23, the early bid bluff. You could go in early on a player as well, especially if it's a player that you're pretty confident you're not going to get stuck with a bid that you didn't actually want to place on the player. But you can make it seem like you're interested in the player and thus maybe increase the price that the player goes for if you don't want them. It's early bid bluff. And you also may want to go back and forth between late bids and early bids for what's a bluff and what's not. That's part of the fun of auction drafts, is to try and keep up with how the table's playing. Kind of like poker in a way. Tip 24 is bid edging. You have a player who you're pretty sure is going to go to a certain team. You're pretty sure they're going to bid more than everyone else. But just to be safe, to make sure they pay a fair price, you keep increasing the bid by 1 whenever you get the chance. You do it enough so that you don't end up with the player, but they don't get him for an amazing deal. You don't want to let anyone get an amazing deal in an auction draft if you can avoid it. Especially want to do this if a player's about to get an amazing deal on a player and you have money in your budget. You need to kind of police the bidding that's going on there if you have a lot of money in your budget. That's your duty as the temporary cash cow at the table. As the temporary whale, I guess. Next section is roster construction. So this is just how you want to build your team in general. Less about the individual moves you make, more about what you're going for. Tip 25, do not keep a backup kicker, defense, tight end, or in a lot of cases, quarterback. Everyone has access to free agents. And outside of when players go on waivers, you can just pick up whatever free agent you want and stick him in your starting lineup if your, say, starting in tight end gets injured. You can just find one, usually that's as good as any backup you would have had, and plug them in there. It's not worth the roster spot. You want to use your bench spots for players that might be worth a lot, that are investments. Backup running backs that might become starters. Wide receivers that might get a lot of volume or have a lot of talent they haven't shown yet. Players that you may use in the future. Players that may be way better than free agents in the future. Don't use up 3 or 4 bench spots having a kicker or a defense or a tight end, and in some cases a quarterback. Again, that you might be able to just get 99% as good of a player, but just by picking up a free agent. It's not worth the spot. Tip 26, bye week stacking. Now, stacking usually refers to where you place multiple players on your starting lineup that are in the same NFL team, say a quarterback and a wide receiver, with the intent that they are positively correlated and they thus score a lot of points together. My personal strategy, I don't usually pay any attention to bye weeks when I'm building my team. If you do look at bye weeks, my recommendation is to try and put as many buys in the same week as possible and combine it with tip 27. Make that combined bye week as late as possible. The reason why you want them all to have buys together is because you'd rather have 1 week where you're very likely to lose as opposed to a few weeks in a row where you're just the underdog. It's more efficient to get all your poor performance at the same time. If you put all your players' bye weeks in the same week, you're going to have a low chance of winning in that week. If you do a good job picking up free agents, you might win anyway, and you've now avoided all the challenges of bye weeks in one swoop. You might get lucky with one really good free agent pickup. The later your bye week is, especially if it's a lot of players on your team all stacked together, the later that week is in the season, the more likely it is you're going to pull this strategy off. That's tip number 27, is that late buys are better, whereas tip 26 was stack bye weeks together. Tip 28. Assume all backup running backs get a shot. Now, this is a very 2023 tip. I might not have given this tip 10 or 15 years ago in fantasy football. When you're drafting players, especially rookie running backs, you want to assume that every backup is going to have at least 1 or 2 games during the season where they get a chance to show their team what they can do as a starter. Running backs get injured at such a high rate. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but the value of a rookie starting running back with a lot of tread left on the tires, that's more talented than everyone knew, is immense in fantasy football. So you go into a draft, assume that the player is going to get some sort of a shot, that you're not just drafting a rookie who's going to be dead weight. Remember that your goal in fantasy football is to win the league, and that often means having a team that's way better than average. So you need to take some high variance plays, some players that might go off, and the backup running back, especially the rookie backup running back, is a very good candidate for that. Tip 29, use positively correlated stacks. So this goes back to what I was saying with stacks earlier. Quarterbacks and running backs are negatively correlated when they're on the same team. Quarterbacks and wide receivers and tight ends are positively correlated. Well, quarterbacks and wide receivers are. Quarterbacks and tight ends are. Wide receivers and tight ends aren't necessarily positively correlated. But what you want to have is positively correlated stacks on your team. And the reason for this is if they all string together a good season, that brings your team to a level of where you have a higher chance of winning the championship. Whereas the more conservative play, where you have players that are negatively correlated, they're going to keep you middle of the pack. That's not going to make a big difference in your chances of winning the title. You don't just want to be above 500 in a league. You want to be good enough to really increase your chance of winning the championship. That's what you play fantasy football for, is to win the championship.
You play to win the game.
Go for the high variance, high upside, positively correlated stack player. Tip number 30. Stack your injured players. It includes stacking players in injured reserve or on the PUP list, which is where they may start the season, but for the rules of the NFL, you can't go on the PUP list. You have to start on the PUP list. PUP list is gone by, midway through the year. Once you draft a player who's injured to start the year, you set yourself up to have payoff later in the season. You'd rather have your players miss time later in the season because you have more time to build a roster around them. It's not ideal to have players that are injured to start off the year. However, if you're going to do it, and you're going to do it with a major player, say draft a player in the first few rounds, so the first 3 rounds that's injured for the first few weeks of the year, at that point, go all in. Get a bunch of players that are injured at the beginning of the year. Because that means that maybe you can squeak out a win or two in the beginning of the year. It's going to be tough, but when they all show up, you'll probably have one of, if not the best teams in the league, done it right. And they didn't end up in a situation where a player you thought was going to come back, like what Peyton Manning did with his neck injury for the Colts and then never comes back. Yeah, I drafted Peyton Manning that year. That wasn't fun. If there's a good chance they're going to come back, stack them together, and then when they all show up, you're going to feel like you have a stacked, no pun intended, stacked team. Next section, trading tips. Tip number 31. Open negotiations with the question, would it be impossible to get player X? Obviously, you replace player X with whatever players you're trying to trade for. There's a reason why. This actually goes back to a negotiation tip from former FBI hostage negotiator Chris Voss. It's easy for people to say no. It's much easier for them to say no than it is to say yes. If you ask the question, is it impossible to trade for, say, Christian McCaffrey? They'll be more comfortable to say no, it's not impossible, as opposed to saying, yes, you can potentially have Christian McCaffrey. If you just say, can I have Christian McCaffrey? Can I give you a package to get Christian McCaffrey? They're going to say no, because it's easy to say no. They're not going to say yes to that. But if you actually have it impossible, they're going to say no, it's not impossible. So open that way. You're more likely to get them in a mindset where they're willing to think about what would be possible to make this trade work. Tip 32, set expirations on your trade offers. If your league gives the option, set an expiration date on your trade offer that's pretty short. 2 reasons for this. 1, you don't want to offer a trade that, because of things happening, say injuries, becomes a bad idea for your team and then you're stuck with it. Second reason you want to set expirations is you create a sense of scarcity. Players are more likely to accept, another manager is more likely to accept a trade if they feel like they have to. That's kind of the logic between the sale. It's like, sale ends today. Only 3% is left to claim on this deal. It's a good idea to try and induce a sense of urgency with your trade offers. Tip number 33, free up roster spots with trades. Now, this is also assuming that you don't have rules in your league that make it prohibitive to add players, either because maybe you have to pay every time you add a player, or maybe you're actually the worst player in your league and you don't want to rely on your knowledge of free agents to do this. When you're trading for players, I would much rather be in the spot of trading 2 players for 1 as opposed to 1 for 2. And the reason why is because you're going to get that extra roster and you get another player for free. You're picking the litter in a lot of cases of all the free agents. It means that you get more out of the trade. The other player instead has to drop a player that might have turned out well. So that's a hidden cost in there. It's a 2-for-1 trade isn't just 2 for 1. It's 2 for 1 and that free agent spot, whoever it is. Tip 34, trade on Wednesdays. The reason why you would trade on Wednesday, usually leagues will have a review period for trades. Whether a commissioner review for vetoes or a league vote, you're probably going to have a 1, maybe 2-day period review for trades. So if you make a trade on Wednesday, the players might be locked out for Thursday and Friday. At least if you're starting the conversation on Wednesday, there's a much higher chance you get the trade done with enough time that you can play the players than the week you actually traded for them. You don't want to make a trade on Saturday, unless you're really savvy. You don't want to make a trade on Saturday with the results of the Sunday games as an unknown commodity. Tip 35, the 3-for-3 sandwich trade. Now, this is a little bit of a complicated one, but bear with me. If you have a player you really want to get, especially a player that you think you have somewhat of inside knowledge on, this could be anyone. This could be, maybe you saw Ty Chandler play and you just think he's way better than Alexander Madison. So you want to trade for him before his value picks up. But you don't want to tip off the other managers that you really like Ty Chandler, or that it may behoove them to think highly of Ty Chandler. My preferred methods for this is the 3-for-3 sandwich trade. You usually offer 3 players on your side and pick 3 players on the opposing team to trade for, where the player you want is in the middle of the 3. You have your target who's in the middle. You want to be trading for a decoy stud, a player who's better than your target that your other manager will think is the real purpose of the trade. And you want to have a throw-in at the bottom. That player's in there just as a negotiating piece. This means that of the 6 players in the trade proposal, 4 of them you could potentially negotiate with by either increasing what you offer or by, say, coming back and say you don't need the throw-in player or something like that. The thing is, you don't want to change the target or the decoy because you don't want to tip off, again, to the other manager that you actually think that target is a pretty good player, because they may change their opinion of the player once they get a trade offer for them. That happens. That's a normal thing to do. Tip number 36, offer meaningless trades. You know which trade's the hardest? The first trade. It's easier to make a trade with someone you've already made a trade with, especially if you're not the only ones in the league making trades. Early in the season, you may want to make trades. Just make low value, low impact trade offers to players, the other managers, and see, what goes through. Worst case scenario, you develop a good relationship with them, and it's easier to negotiate trades later on, as you already have a bit of a rapport. Tip number 37, remember bye weeks when you're looking at trades. If you're known for making low impact trades that are not really trying to trick anyone or anyone like that, you also may set yourself up well to do a meaningless trade that isn't meaningless. And that may be a trade where you have a fringe starter that you don't want to have to bench because of their bye week coming up, and you trade for a player whose bye week is already passed. So this might be if you just don't have great tight ends. Swap a tight end for, say, a wide receiver 3 of similar value, already been on the bye. Or maybe trade for a tight end. If your tight end's bye week is coming up, maybe swap your wide receiver 3 for a tight end that isn't on bye, and then swap your tight end for their wide receiver 3. You get the idea. Tip 38, fab and trade. Your free agent waiver budget, going back to the waivers section of the program, is an asset that you have. And in some cases, there will be players in the league who really want to get a player on waivers, but there's no chance of them winning the bid because they've used up all of their budget. If there's nothing in your league constitution preventing this, you can make an agreement with that player to say, you bid a certain amount on a player and win the bid, and if you do, you'll trade him with that player. Or maybe you want it the other way around. You don't have any fab budget, but you really want a player, so you offer a contingent trade with someone else. You actually would rather be in the position of not risking your waiver budget in this. You have to also be clear on what the terms of the deal are for when this trade actually happens. Just remember that it's an option. Knowing all your options is going to increase your chances that you find the right one. Now, for fantasy football, league politics. This is a fun section. We're going to start off with a really fun one. Tip number 39, be the commissioner. Now, I'm not saying be the commissioner because you can slant the game in your favor. Not saying that at all. That is not a good idea. I'm actually not saying that. What I am saying is you want to be the commissioner so no one else does that. I've been in leagues with shady commissioners, and the best way to make sure you don't have a shady commissioner is to be the commissioner. The commissioner does have disproportionate power because the commissioner will be able to do things, mostly invite other players to join the league, that are all sources of corruption. With commissioner power comes great responsibility. So take that on yourself just to make sure everything stays on the even keel. Tip number 40, shuffle schedules, or encourage your commissioner to shuffle your schedules. This very well applies if you are the commissioner of a league. When the fantasy football schedule is generated, usually what happens is the first manager to join the league gets scheduled against the commissioner, and then the schedule gets filled out one by one. With the way fantasy seasons work now, most fantasy leagues will have more regular season weeks than you have teams in a league, so there are going to be a handful of teams in your league you're going to have to play twice. What are the teams you're mostly going to play twice? The teams you're matched up with early in the season, because that's how the schedules work by default. Who's most likely to join the league early? The best, most active fantasy player. There's nothing wrong with shuffling a schedule. It makes it fair. So shuffle the schedules, just wipe the slate clean. And if you're not the commissioner, just encourage the commissioner to do that. Tip 41, become acquainted with everybody. There's nothing more frustrating in a fantasy football league than seeing a trade go through where someone offered a worse deal than you would have offered to get a good player that you wanted. You want to make sure you're on speaking terms with everybody in the league, just to make sure that you're being considered for counteroffers. And you want to be talking to them enough that you know if you have a chance to counteroffer, just like insert yourself in there. Tip number 42, pump up other teams.
To pump You up.
You want other teams to be hesitant to make trades to make the best teams in the league better. You instead want them to be trading with you, which also leads to tip number 43, which goes right along with tip 42. Tip 43 is never appear to be a threat. You never want to brag about your fantasy football team. If anything, you want to be a bit of a doomsday crier. Is that what it's called? The end is nigh. Your fantasy football team is doomed. It's just an awful team. You need to make a trade. If you're winning a lot of games, you want to be clear that it was totally by accident. If you're scoring a lot of points, you want to be clear that this is all temporary without coming off as disingenuous. You want teams that will be willing to make deals with you, and you want them to not be making deals with the studs that are going to actually beat you. Tip 44. Push for your favorite app to be the choice for the league. It's much easier to run a fantasy football team, especially multiple fantasy football teams, on an app you're familiar with. If there's any question of what app to go with, don't try to be objective and say which is the best app. Just go for the app that you use the most. Push for that one. For tip number 45, if the league is going to be going on for a while or has been going on for a while, and you think you're good, push for a large pot. Invest in yourself. Now, if you're in a league that's going to be a short-term league, maybe don't go for a big pot. And I'm not saying push for anything that would lead you to do anything financially irresponsible. I'm not a financial advisor. I just like the stock. But a big pot in a league where you have as good a shot as anybody at winning it is a good investment to keep playing. You also should not play in any leagues that skim any money off the top as like a commissioner fee or anything like that. That's an unpaid job. I just want to be clear about that. Commissioner is unpaid. Tip number 46, push for low variance scoring systems, or rather just normal scoring systems. You don't want to play in a league that has a bunch of big play bonuses and team defenses that can score 40 points in a week, because that increases the chance that the person who has no idea what they're doing wins the league. And unless that player is you, which, I mean, if that's you, kudos to you for looking for tips online. Unless that's you, it's against your best interest to have a high variance scoring system. You want to have something that's as predictable as possible. Fantasy football, it's always going to have variance. That's the fun of it. The less variance you have, the more likely it is the experts are going to win. And this also goes for having, say, kickers in the league. Kickers by themselves are a source of variance, as are, honestly, team defenses. Tip 47, protest the 1 week trade. So this is one where I'm comfortable saying you should protest this. Is right on the line of what counts as collusion in a league. Really depends on the opinion of the person. A 1 week trade is where two teams make a trade and then a week later they trade back. This is usually to cover, the reason they do this is to cover for each other's bye weeks or some other situation like that. You could argue this is collusion. You could also argue that it's perfectly fine. But if two teams are doing this, they're getting an advantage that you don't have. And I wouldn't recommend engaging in this because it's so controversial. So you should push to make this illegal just for the sake of making it fair. It's too controversial to allow. You don't want to get into the game of 1 week trades and everything like that either. That's a slippery slope. Tip number 48. If you're in a big league, in a one quarterback league, push to have that quarterback spot be a super flex spot. Now that doesn't make it a super flex league. That's actually the opposite of what you want for a really big league. You just want to make sure that if you're in like a 16-team league or bigger, someone else is following tip number 6 and is scooping up all the starting QBs, you want to make sure you have the option to at least start your next best player in that spot so you don't have an empty roster slot. It's a reasonable way to go. That's what NFL teams do. They don't play with nobody at quarterback. They put like a wide receiver over there. Although if you do have this tip, it does invalidate number 6. Tip number 49, advocate to update the rules and make small changes every year. And this one might be the most questionable one I'm going to suggest, but if you're up to speed in your league and you know what's going on, a rules change helps you out. Something, say, as simple as making it so tight ends are no longer eligible in flex spots or something like that. I don't know. It doesn't matter. The point is, as those changes are in, you're less likely to be stuck and forget about a change than someone else. Push for a little bit of a change each year. Maybe give yourself a little bit of an edge. And, just make sure it's always an improvement, to the league. Because there's always something you can improve, right? Final category of tips, mental health. This is going to be especially important if you're following some of the more morally questionable tips and your conscience is bothered. Tip number 50, keep a schedule. Use your phone's alarms or alerts or something like that to remind yourself each day to do something. I actually have a video on this of what to do each day during the fantasy week to make sure you check all the basics. A lot of the tips that I've said here are in that actual video and I've been expanding on a little bit. Keep a schedule. You won't miss the 11:30 rush. You won't miss the chance to propose some trades on Wednesdays. You won't miss the chance to clear out your flex spot before a Thursday night game. So keep a schedule. Tip number 51, manage multiple teams. This one sounds counterintuitive for mental health, but hear me out. When you're watching fantasy football, with fantasy football implications, One of the worst things you can have for your mental health is to be rooting for a player, especially like a wide receiver who gets the ball at most like 10 times in the game. Over the course of a 3.5 hour game, that can be excruciating to watch. Just hoping every play that player's on offense, that they get the ball. I don't recommend that. What I do recommend to offset it is to have a handful of fantasy teams so that you can't be sure that that's actually what you want in a given week. You might be playing against the player you have in one league, or you might have the defense, or you maybe have another player that you need to score even more. You want to have enough of those so that you can take a break from fantasy football and just watch football sometimes, because watching football for the purpose of fantasy can be stressful. Tip number 52, don't check the scores until a lot of the games are done. It's unnecessary stress on your system if you see at 3:30 p.m. your chances of winning are 15%. And then at 5 p.m. your chances of winning are 80%. And then at 10 p.m. your chances of winning are back down to 45%. And it's just a lot. So as you inevitably have to check your lineup throughout the course of a Sunday to make sure you're not starting any injured players, do the little thing where you like blur your eyes and don't quite look at the scores, or even put your hand over the side of the screen in that app where the scores are going to be, and just do your checks to make sure no one's out or is deactivated. Me, I don't check scores generally until after the 4 o'clock games are done. That's 4 o'clock Eastern games are done. Unless I'm feeling a very, easygoing that day, and I think that it's going to be like, whatever. Like, let's say it's already lost, pile it on. Tip number 53, limit your exposure to single players. In the interest of winning a league, you want to have all your, eggs in one basket, and that basket might get shot to the moon, which would be a good thing. If you have multiple leagues, it might not be worth the risk to do it in all of them, at least the same players in all of them. I have a rule. I never have a player in more than half of my leagues. And the reason why is just when they have that bad game, it's just too painful. It's just the way I'm wired. It is suboptimal to limit your decisions in any team. I want to say that. This will slightly decrease your chances of winning on paper. It will increase the chances that you don't throw your laptop through the window when your quarterback in 4 out of your 5 leagues gets hurt in the first quarter. Tip number 54, split the pot. If you're in a league with an especially big pot and you got a lot of money on the line and it's just too much for your blood to handle, offer to split the pot with the other player. And this could be in a championship game, could be in a third place game, who knows? That at least allow you to watch and find out who the champion is with a little bit less at stake. Plus, you'll usually make a lot of money in this way anyway, especially if it was a big enough pot worth splitting, you're going to make out pretty well. And tip number 55, expect to lose. Most teams will not win their fantasy league. And if you have multiple teams, unless you get up to 5 or 6 teams and you're pretty good, you're not likely to win any of them. You want to go into the expectation of, I'm going to be middle of the pack, barely make the playoffs or just miss it for all these teams. And anything above that is gravy. Set your baseline reasonably so that the season isn't just a series of, your beautiful plans coming apart. You want to be building, not taking down. So there you have it. 55 tips to help you win your fantasy football league. Are there any tips I missed that have nothing to do with 2023 or nothing to do with watching football? Feel free to throw them in the comments. Hope you appreciated this video. Please like and subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. And good luck winning your championships.